In the year 303, an emperor decided the gods demanded blood. His name was Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletian, ruler of an empire crumbling under fear and superstition. He believed the Roman gods had turned against him because their altars stood empty and the followers of a single foreign god dared to defy them. To him, Christianity was not faith, it was rebellion against Rome itself. From his palace in Nicomedia, he swore that every trace of this faith would be erased. His priests called it purification, his generals called it duty, but Diocletian called it destiny. He would restore divine order through fire and iron. Across the marble halls, his commands spread like smoke, and before the sun set, the empire began its darkest cleansing. Rome was about to burn its own soul, to please its forgotten gods. At dawn, the sound of hammers echoed through Nicomedia. Soldiers marched through the streets, carrying Diocletian's first edict sealed in crimson wax. The order was merciless, every church to be destroyed, every scripture to be burned, and every Christian to be erased from Rome's protection. By midday, smoke rose above the city, curling like dark prayers toward the gods. The grand church near the palace shattered beneath axes, its walls collapsing as sacred texts turned to ash. Those who resisted were dragged through the streets, beaten until their faith broke, or their bodies did. Yet as the flames climbed higher, even the soldiers began to whisper. Some feared the gods had grown silent, others felt the air change as if something unseen was watching. Diocletian had wanted obedience, but what he created instead was terror, and terror has a way of turning against its master. The fires of Nicomedia had barely faded when Diocletian turned his wrath toward the leaders of the faith, believing that if the shepherds were destroyed the flock would scatter. Across the empire soldiers hunted bishops as traitors, dragging them from hiding places into the streets. In Nicomedia, Bishop Anthimus was chained and scourged with iron whips until his blood stained the marble floor, yet he refused to kneel. In Alexandria, Bishop Peter was locked in darkness for months, starved and beaten before his secret execution, his body buried in silence. In North Africa, Felix of Thibauca was branded with red-hot metal across his face while Roman guards forced burning scripture before his eyes, mocking the god he served. Each death was meant to silence faith, but the silence became echo. Crowds gathered in shadows, whispering the names of the dead. The emperor believed he had crushed their spirit, but something far older than Rome had begun to rise. Soon the empire itself began to burn. In city after city, the fires of Diocletian's command turned from decree to ritual. Christians were no longer merely executed, they were offered to the flames as proof of loyalty to Rome. In Nicomedia, men and women were dragged into public squares, bound together, and drenched in oil. Torches were thrown, and the crowd was ordered to watch as their screams rose like hymns of defiance. In Caesarea and Antioch, the same scene unfolded, pyres built so high their smoke darkened the sky. Even children were thrown into the fire beside their parents. To Diocletian's governors, it was justice. To the people, it was terror. Yet among the ashes, something strange began to happen. Witnesses spoke of victims who sang as they burned, their voices calm, unbroken, and haunting. Soldiers who once obeyed without thought began to tremble. The emperor believed fire could erase faith, but faith was learning to live inside the flames. When the flames failed to break their spirit, Diocletian turned to an older form of terror, one Rome had perfected long before. In the great arenas of Caesarea and Tyre, iron gates creaked open and lions, leopards, and bears were unleashed upon the condemned. Christians were stripped, chained, and thrown into the sand before roaring crowds. Mothers clutched their children as beasts tore through flesh, the air filled with cheers and prayer alike. The emperor's decree demanded that no one look away. Blood became entertainment, and mercy became treason. Yet even as the beasts fed, something darker stirred within the spectators. Some began to weep, unable to explain why the dying looked freer than the living. The crowds came to watch the end of a faith, but what they saw instead was its beginning. Rome thought it ruled fear, but fear itself was starting to change sides. By now, Rome was drowning in its own cruelty. The prisons built for thieves and killers overflowed with bishops, priests, and readers. Chains rusted from the tears of men who refused to renounce their faith. Diocletian called it purification, but his empire was beginning to rot from within. Markets stood empty, soldiers deserted their posts, and whispers spread that the gods had turned away. Even his most loyal advisors avoided his eyes, afraid to glimpse the madness that now ruled him. He dreamed of omens, temples cracking, statues weeping blood, voices echoing through marble halls. Yet he refused to stop. Each new execution only deepened his conviction that Rome could be saved through more pain, more blood, more silence. But beneath the fear, something invisible was growing. The same faith he tried to crush was quietly learning to endure. And soon, it would outlive him, his empire, and the very gods he killed for. The more Diocletian tried to erase the faith, the deeper it carved itself into the soul of Rome. Martyrs became symbols, their ashes carried in secret, their stories whispered in catacombs and markets. Each death that was meant to frighten instead fed the movement with new devotion. The emperor's fire had forged something unbreakable. In villages, soldiers sent to hunt believers returned converted. In cities, Roman citizens began to protect the condemned, hiding them beneath their own roofs. The empire that once worshipped fear now trembled before it. Diocletian's gods had fallen silent, yet the prayers of his victims still echoed through his temples. He had wanted to destroy a belief. Instead, he had given it a crown of immortality. And as the empire's marble walls began to crack, one question haunted even his generals. What if Rome's greatest threat was never the Christians, but the curse born from killing them? By the time Diocletian's crown began to rust, his empire was already bleeding from within. The temples he had built stood silent, their altars cold, their priests whispering of omens they could not explain. The faith he tried to bury had taken root beneath his throne, spreading through his soldiers, his cities, and even his own court. When illness struck him, legends say he saw visions of the same martyrs he had burned, their eyes calm, their lips whispering prayers over his bed. He fled the capital and vanished into obscurity, leaving behind an empire haunted by what he had unleashed. Rome had not been purified, it had been transformed. The gods he worshipped were forgotten, but the faith he tried to erase endured for centuries. And as history turned its pages, one truth remained unshaken. Diocletian believed he was saving Rome, but he was only lighting the fire that would consume it.